A lot of you probably know about the Chilean mining accident of 2010. It was also called the Los 33 because of the 33 miners trapped underground. It's amazing that all 33 survived the entire 69 days it took until they were rescued. There was a whole media circus about it, with an estimated billion people watching the rescue on TV or the internet. There was so much news that one fact was completely drowned out, and to me, is the most important one of all. I became interested in the topic because of a school paper I was writing. The mention of the paper to my grandfather, which was a terrible mistake because he is zealous about school. He was trying to get my mother to enroll me in an international baccalaureate college prep school at first grade. Education is my future. He wishes he had those opportunities when he was a kid, and I'm an ungrateful brat for taking my fortune for blessing, you know the drill. Anyway, he wouldn't let me use Wikipedia or any easy source for the essay. Instead, he called up an old friend who actually worked on the rescue crew in Chile. So what should have been an hour-long paper turned into an hour phone interview, 3 hours of driving, and a whole book about rescue operations. Who, since the internet has been invented, ever needed to read a book about anything? Meeting the rescue worker guy was pretty interesting, though. He had tan leather skin like you'd expect to find on a car seat instead of a person. His accent was a little thick, and sometimes he couldn't find the right words, so he had to switch it to Spanish. I know next to zero Spanish, but my grandfather would make me write down everything he said verbatim so I could translate it at home. Granddad literally said, "If you try to take the easy road in life, life is going to take the easy road with you, right up your ass." I don't know what that means, but I really didn't feel like asking him to clarify. About halfway through the interview with the rescue guy, my grandfather got up to go to the bathroom. I was asking questions about how many people were down there, and he kept saying 32, or 32. The movie's even called The 33. Everything online says The 33, but he was adamant. Then he gave me this weird look, like he was shell-shocked or something. The kind of blank look you expect to see Holocaust survivors wearing. He leaned in real close and started rattling off some stuff in English and some in Spanish, and I did my best to keep up. It wasn't until the car ride home when I was able to translate what he said. I checked it half a dozen times. I even ran the transcript by my grandfather, who's fluent but still made me do my own translating first. Here's what we put together. All the media, the news, the story spinners, they all say 33 miners were trapped. And why wouldn't they? 33 people came out of that mine. The miners were trapped 700 meters in the ground. There was no way in or out. But the miners who come out, right when I first pulled them out, they all say the same thing. There were only 32 miners trapped. They count and they count. Every day, every few hours, so everybody's taken care of. And then one day, they count again, and there's 33. But they were a band of brothers. You can't go through an ordeal like that and not become family. And they stuck by each other. They never said one of them didn't belong. But I heard stories. They say one miner didn't sleep like the others. He just sat against the wall and hummed some tune nobody recognized. They say one miner didn't eat like the others, but they didn't complain because they had to save their provisions. They say one miner, they know who, but they no telling, one miner didn't talk about his family or friends or wanting to get out. All this one miner talked about was how comforting the darkness felt. How they, the trapped miners, were the lucky ones. That the earth only swallowed the deserving ones, because she would keep them safe, and all the rest would drown in a sea of fire of their own kindling. I was the last in a long line of grandkids on both sides of the family. No one has ever said as much, but I'm pretty sure I was an oops baby, the result of one too many glasses of wine and a couple over 40 who thought unplanned pregnancies were for teens. Oops. By the time I came along, both of my grandmothers had already passed away, and my grandfathers were elderly and lived in different states. Trying to coordinate travel plans for a family of 5, including an infant, was difficult on a budget, and neither of my grandpas were up to frequent trips, so visits were rare and spaced out over long periods. Still, both of my parents wanted me to have a relationship with them, so we'd trade phone calls so they could hear my nonsensical baby babble. They'd write me letters for Mom and Dad to read to me, and they'd get crayon scribbles in return. When I was 3, they both started to experience declines in health. First my maternal grandpa, then my paternal one. Fearing the worst, Mom purchased a pair of teddy bears, the kind that had recorders in them so you could record a message that would play when the bear was hugged, and made sure to get a message saved from both. My mom's father died when I was 4. A few days after his funeral, I was given a white teddy bear with bright blue eyes that twinkled from beneath a plaid flat cap and a green sweater. When I gave it a squeeze, I heard my grandpa's slightly muffled voice from its stomach. "I love you, Sadie." 2 years later, after Dad's father passed, I got the other one. It was a slate gray color, and the stitching on his face gave him a rather serious expression for a stuffed animal. A pair of red suspenders held up his tan trousers. I fell asleep hugging it, and my dad told me some years later, with tears in his eyes, that randomly throughout the night, he kept hearing Grandpop's voice coming from my room. "I love you, Sadie." I named my white bear Fran and my gray bear Jock, and put them on a shelf above my bed where they sat throughout my childhood. Honestly, I didn't give them much thought. They'd become fixtures of my room, the same way the lamp and the dresser were. Every now and again, I'd come home from school to find one of my parents standing beside my bed, looking up at the bears or giving them a little squeeze. Even as time passed, they still recited their single phrase without fail. Aside from those instances, though, Fran and Jock were little more than dust collectors from my childhood. When I first went away to college, the two didn't make the cut and were left behind while I made my way out into the world for the first time. I think my parents were a little disappointed that I wasn't more sentimental over the teddies, but any memories I had of my grandpas were hazy at best, and I didn't have the same emotional connection that they did. When Mom gently asked about whether I'd like them when I moved into my first apartment, I told her no, that they were probably better off with her. "Okay," she said. "Well, they'll be here if you change your mind." I was pretty confident I wouldn't. The next time I went back to my parents' place was to house sit while Dad took Mom on their long-awaited vacation out west. He'd been promising her they'd go for over 30 years, and they were both buzzing with excitement. In typical Mom fashion, however, she was also very nervous. "You remember where all the financial documents are in case anything happens to us, right?" she asked from the back seat at least 6 times on the drive to the airport. "Yes, and the white bin under your bed. And the wills? Fireproof lockbox in the back of your closet. And I think she's got it, hon," Dad said, reaching back to give her knee a squeeze. Mom harumphed and sat back. "And just call if you need anything." "I'll be fine, don't worry. You're only going for a week." "Oh, a lot can happen in a week," she said. I grinned at her in the rearview mirror, unconcerned, and she made a face at me, but seemed to relax. After I dropped them off, I drove back to their place and started to make myself at home again. I tossed my suitcase on my bed and went to the kitchen to make some dinner and catch up on one of my shows. It'd been a while since I'd had a true, completely free week all to myself, and I planned to take full advantage of it. After I ate, I kicked up my feet, stretched out, and commenced lazy lump mode. I managed to get almost 3 episodes in before I started to nod off. I checked the clock over the TV and sighed. It was only just after 11. Was I really turning into an old, early-to-bed woman already? The horror. I rolled off the couch and shut off the TV and all the lights, plunging the house into a deep darkness. Even in the inky black, I didn't feel a twinge of nervousness. I'd grown up in the house. I knew it like the back of my hand, and all of its creaks and groans were almost comforting. I made my way to my room and flipped on the light. It had been at least 5 years since I lived here, but my parents hadn't done much to change my room except store a few bits and bobs in the closet. They said it was so I'd know I'd always have a place with them. I thought it was because changing it would make the fact that I was out for good more real. Whatever the reason, I appreciated the familiarity. As I started to unpack my bag, my eye was drawn to the shelf over my bed. Fran and Jock, ever vigilant, were sitting in the same spots they'd occupied for most of my life. I don't know why, but I couldn't help but smile and reach out to them. I took Fran down first and gave his little cap a tweak before squeezing him around the stomach. "I love you, Sadie," Grandpa said. After putting Fran back, I did the same to Jock, who stared at me with his usual sternness even as I plucked one red suspender. "I love you, Sadie," Grandpop said. It was the first time I'd listened to them in a while. Even if they didn't resonate as deeply with me as they did my parents, I was still glad to find the recording still worked. A quick trip to the bathroom and a change in my PJs later, I was in bed and fast falling asleep. I can't say exactly what woke me. A nightmare, I figured, given that my heart was beating quite quickly, but I couldn't remember any details. I took a deep breath and rolled over, already falling half asleep again, and found myself face to face with a dark figure on the pillow beside me. I yelped and sat up, grabbing at my phone, my nearest source of light, and shined it towards my bed. Fran was lying on his side beside me. I let out a small chuckle and gave myself a little shake to dismiss the lingering fright that he'd caused and picked him up. "Did you fall off the shelf?" I asked him quietly. I must have put him back too close to the edge earlier, and gravity had done its duty. I gave Fran a gentle squeeze. "Get out." I stared down at the bear and blinked once, very slowly. I must be more sleepy than I realized, I thought. I was hearing things. To prove to myself that it had just been my imagination, I squeezed him again. "Get out." It was still Grandpa's voice, but instead of the soft warmth it had always had, it sounded cold, almost menacing. I threw Fran across the room where he hit the wall. From over my head, I heard Grandpop's more gravelly voice. "Get out." I whipped around and looked up at Jock. He was sitting in the same place as always, but now he was turned toward the door instead of facing forward. Had I put him down like that? I couldn't remember. "Get out," Grandpa's voice came from Fran again, louder this time. "Get out!" Grandpa echoed from Jock. The two went back and forth, their voices getting louder and louder until I slapped my hands over my ears and leapt from my bed. I wanted to scream, but my voice was stuck behind my fear-tangled tongue. I stumbled across my dark room, chased by my long-dead grandfather's voices. "I know you're down there," Jock shouted with Grandpa's voice. I froze. Down there? Down under the shelf? I glanced over my shoulder at the gray bear staring silently down from over my bed. I had to get out of my room. I had to get out of the house. I yanked open my door. "I see you," Fran said in Grandpa's voice. I was halfway into the hall, tears streaming down my face. I didn't know what was happening. Was I going crazy? Was I dreaming? All I knew is that my two childhood toys were screaming threats at me and I had to get away from them. I turned toward the stairs. "You take one more step, I'll make sure it's your last," Jock bellowed. "Get out!" Fran roared. From somewhere downstairs, a step creaked. Someone else was in the house. They weren't yelling at me at all, I realized, with a very strange mix of confusing relief and newly formed horror. They were yelling at the intruder who was making their way up the stairs, towards me. "Get out!" my grandfathers howled together. Footsteps clambered across the wooden floor downstairs. Something fell over in the living room with a loud crash, and again in the kitchen before the back door slammed against the counter as it was thrown open and a car engine rumbled to life. Somehow I regained my wits enough to run to my parents' room and look out the window to the driveway below. An SUV was peeling backwards out into the street. It slammed into the neighbor's mailbox, righted itself, and then screeched off into the night. A heavy quiet had fallen over the house again. After waiting a few long, tense minutes, I crept back across the hall and peeked into my room. Fran and Jock were where I'd left them, both completely silent. When they stayed that way, I hesitantly approached Fran, who was lying on his side with his little flat cap beside him. I picked him up and, with trembling fingers, squeezed his stomach. "I love you, Sadie," Grandpa said warmly. I put his cap back on his head and gently put him back on the shelf beside Jock and backed out of the room, watching them the whole time with wide eyes. I rounded the corner, heading downstairs to the phone. I heard Grandpa's voice trailing after me. "I love you, Sadie." The police arrived a bit later, following my frantic call to 911. I filed a report, leaving out the bit about my talking bears, and allowed them to collect whatever evidence they could. Every so often I found myself glancing at the stairs, almost like I was expecting a repeat of whatever had just happened. It never came, and the cops wrapped it up, leaving me alone again. When I called my parents to tell them about the break-in, they immediately wanted to rush home, but I assured them there was no need. "Really," I said, "I don't think I have anything to worry about." "We could be on the next plane," Mom insisted. "No, I'm okay. Whoever that guy was, I'm pretty sure he won't be back." It took a few more go-arounds, but I eventually convinced them I was safe. And I felt it, too, for the most part. After the initial shock had worn off and I'd had time to process what had happened, I was really okay. I couldn't explain it. I couldn't tell anyone what had happened without sounding crazy, but I knew it had been real, and I knew, as long as I had Fran and Jock sitting on the shelf above my bed, I could sleep easy. A few days later, the cops did find the guy who broke in. He was a co-worker of my dad's who'd overheard he'd be out of town. He thought the house would be empty and easy pickings. When he tried to tell them about the two crazy guys upstairs and their violent threats, they rolled their eyes and laughed at him. He was very surprised to hear that only a 22-year-old woman had been in the house during his botched burglary. When I returned home to my apartment a week later, Fran and Jock were with me. I keep them on the TV stand in the living room now, where they each have a full view of the front door. Whenever I start to feel a bit anxious about being alone, I'll give each bear a little squeeze and smile as they speak. "I love you, Sadie." And now I respond, "I love you both too." Humans don't have a psychological need to sleep. Over time, chemical levels of androgen build up, which cause the sleepy feeling, but that is simply a trigger designed to force our bodies to rest. Some scientists have theorized that this is an evolutionary mechanism intended to prevent us from wasting unnecessary energy while keeping us hidden during the night. Well, there isn't any shortage of calories to consume, and there's nothing going on to eat me in the night, so as far as I'm concerned, sleep is just an antiquated fetter which humans should leave behind. We don't need sleep to live, but we cannot survive without dreaming. And if you stay awake for long enough, you'll start to dream, even while awake. The more you try to fight those dreams, the more real they will become. Pretty soon you can't tell which is the dream and which is real, or whether there's a difference at all. That's the story I told the police and my attorney, and it's the story I'm sticking with now. It started when I read an article in my psychology class about this Vietnamese insomniac named Thai Ngoc, who hasn't slept in 43 years. It said he had some kind of fever and then never felt the urge to sleep again. Even working full-time, it's like he has a vacation every night. I don't know about you, but for a stressed out college student always trying to cram for the latest test, that sounded like a lifesaver. I'm paying my own way through college with a work-study program, and trying to maintain a social life in the half-hour break I have between class and work is absolutely impossible. I'm tired and stressed and missing out on what is supposed to be the best years of my life because I never have a free moment to be myself. If I could find a way to waste less time sleeping, though, maybe things would get better. I did some reading and became obsessed with the idea. If we sleep for 8 hours and are awake 16, then eliminating sleep would be the equivalent to adding around 40 years of my lifespan, assuming an 80-year life. I found some studies about a drug being tested on mice called orexin A, which was supposed to completely eliminate the need for sleep. It hadn't been approved for human trials yet, but there weren't any negative side effects found in the mice. If anything, they seemed more active than ever. And the best part was, research for this drug was being done right at UCLA, where I go to school. Well, I was able to find where the lab was easily enough, although I didn't expect them just to hand me the chemicals. I tried to get an internship there, but they required at least 20 hours a week, and I couldn't even begin to fit that into my schedule. I forgot about the whole thing until I overheard Ricky, one of the other students in my psych class, mentioning that he got the internship. Ricky was boasting about using the keys to sneak into the lab at night and get high off of the anesthesia they used on rats. If he doesn't sound like an idiot yet, then add a tank top that says, "I party with sluts," a hat with the Obey sticker, and a skateboard which he carries around to look cool but doesn't know how to ride. You get the idea. But that was fine with me, because it made it a simple matter to pretend to be his friend. All I had to do was turn my hat backward, make a couple dumb jokes about the blonde sitting in front, high-five him when she bent over, and voila. Suddenly we were bros. Future of American science right there. It didn't take many hints before he invited me to the lab. I found where the orexin A experiments were just by looking up the faculty directory in charge, and before my buddy finished coming down from huffing anesthesia, I had a whole backpack full of little spray bottles of orexin. It was nasally administrated, but I didn't care as long as it worked. And holy hell, it worked alright. 20 squirts up each nostril. It seemed like a lot, but I controlled the dosage to 1 milligram per kilogram body weight, which was equivalent to the dose the mice were getting. I played Skyrim straight into the dawn. Okay, so it wasn't quite self-actualization, but I hadn't any free time in a while, and it was great to have the constant pressure off me. The night was so quiet, and by the early morning it just felt like the entire world was made just for me. I didn't feel tired until the following night, and I just took another dose, and all the weariness washed away. I spent the second night reading Shakespeare just for fun. How else would anyone ever have the time for that? There was so much to do and learn about the world, and finally I had the chance to do it all. It was the best thing I could ever hope for. The one thing the mice hadn't mentioned during their experiments, however, was that you can still dream without sleeping. They started on the third day, little visual abnormalities that dance around the corner of my vision. Patterns or shapes or textures just drifting idly by. I actually enjoyed them at first, but the longer I went without sleep, the more real they became. By the fifth day, I actually started seeing fully formed people walking alongside me. They were always in my peripheral vision, and as soon as I turned to face them, they disappeared. It was the evening of the sixth day when I opened my bedroom to see a smiling figure sitting on my bed. It didn't even have a face, just teeth, which wrapped all the way up around where its ears should be. I splashed cold water in my face and the thing disappeared, but it still freaked me out. I decided to take a break from the drug then, but even without it, I couldn't get to sleep that night. There must have still been some in my system. I tossed and turned, and every time I got up, that figure with the teeth was there, watching me. Every time I jolted myself awake, it would linger a little longer in my room, just silently smiling. I managed to get through the next day, still off the drug and still seeing the creature out of the corner of my eye wherever I looked. I got used to him, though, and even began to nod off during the psych lecture. After class, I decided to call in sick from work and just go to sleep. Ricky was trying to talk to me, but I was so tired I couldn't even figure out what he was saying. It was hard to even look at him with the creature standing next to us. I just mumbled something and turned to leave, but the idiot kept following me. I shouldn't have shoved him, but I was so tired I couldn't deal with pretending to be his friend anymore. He stumbled back a few paces, right into the smiling creature. The weirdest thing was, I swear, he bounced off the creature and looked over his shoulder. It seemed stupid to think that he could see my dream, but I was so tired I wasn't thinking straight. I just bolted and ran. Ricky was still following me, though. He was insistent. Something about there being a security camera at the lab, that we had to get our story straight about what we were doing there. I don't know. I just wanted to get home. I just wanted to sleep. I ducked into an alley between the psych and sociology buildings, but I couldn't lose him. He grabbed my shoulder and pulled me to the ground, and I didn't have the strength to fight him off. I was too tired to get up, so I just lay there and let him yell at me. My mind was so numb with exhaustion, even the sound of his shouting faded into a gentle white noise, and I must have fallen asleep right there on the ground. his body was mangled almost beyond recognition. The police told me there were witnesses who saw me jump on top of Ricky and bite his face into a bloody pulp. They said I had some kind of inhuman strength and that it took almost a dozen people to drag me off him. They said I hurled him like a rag doll into the building, dislocating both his shoulders and smashing one of the bricks into powder. I don't know how I could have done it while I was asleep. All I know is that when I was about to drift off, I saw my creature standing behind Ricky, and the last thing I saw before closing my eyes was its teeth sinking into his neck. The court blamed the incident on the drug, and I've been transferred to a rehab clinic. It's been 4 days since I've last taken Orexin, but the creature hasn't gone away. Every time I close my eyes, it's sitting a little closer. Sooner or later I'm going to fall asleep, and it's going to take control again. I'm writing this because if I can't stay awake, I want someone out there to know. Don't blame me for what he does when I'm asleep. I'm fighting it for as long as I can. I've been working at an elementary school as a custodian for over a year now. It pays well, and I'm pretty much left alone to do my section. The school itself was built in the early 60s, with an addition built in 2004. I currently maintain the first floor of the original building, which has about 11 classrooms and 7 bathrooms. It has its moments, but it's a rewarding job with great government benefits and a salary that can maintain my bills. When I first started, my boss said something peculiar that I never really understood. He was giving me the rundown of the building about an hour before my first shift, which is at 3 p.m. He didn't really look at me when he said it, so I just kind of put it in the back of my head. It wasn't until last week when some strange things began to happen that I remembered what he told me. Always stay in the light. Such a strange thing to say, right? I never really gave it much thought. The guy was quirky to begin with, and he never really seemed to be all there, but he was there for 30 years after all, and I guess when you stay in a job that long, your brain begins to misfire. So my first year went without a hitch. I cleaned the rooms, and when winter came, I helped shovel out the school when a heavy snowstorm rolled through. The lights were always on in the school, and they even had safety meetings about switching on the lights before you enter a darkened area, so that you can see any hazards that might be hidden in the dark. Even the teachers were instructed not to turn off their lights so the night workers, such as myself, wouldn't have to go around switching them all back on. This all became routine, and I never really questioned it until one night I entered a dark room without switching on the light. It was about half hour before the night shift ended, and I was running a little behind cleaning the windows. I was about to clean a set of double doors when I realized I'd left my glass cleaner in the previous room on a desk near the door. The room was dark, but I didn't really notice because the hallway illuminated the area, and I needed to go, and I could see the spray bottle as plain as day. I walked into the room without turning on the lights, and that's when things got a little weird. I didn't step into the room for very long, not even 10 seconds, but for those 10 seconds I felt something was watching me from the back of the room near the teacher's desk. I shrugged it off and walked back out with my spray bottle in hand to continue cleaning the windows. I decided to ask one of my coworkers about the lights and all the rules associated with keeping the building lit at all times. Keith, why are there so many rules associated with the lights in this place? I walked in a room without putting the lights on and everything's fine. Keith, who was always a sarcastic and funny person, stopped eating and stared me down as if I just told him his mother had died. What do you mean you walked into a room without turning on the lights? His stare was burning a hole right through me. I could tell immediately that I had messed up. The problem was, I didn't know why. What I mean is that I left a spray bottle in a room and I walked in and grabbed it. I didn't turn on the lights. Look, everyone's being really vague about this and not telling me shit about why we need to leave every freaking light on until we leave the building. I came across like a prick, but I was seriously tired from having people tell me to never enter a room without the lights on, but not explaining it to me at all. I wanted to know. Keith looked down at his food and shook his head and threw out what was left on his plate. He got up slowly and began to walk out of the room, where he stopped and looked back at me. Kid, just listen to us old-timers. Turn the lights off as you finish your room and make sure you don't have to go back. Go finish my section and keep yourself in the light. I'm gonna fix your section and hope it's not too late. I watched him walk out of the room and head toward my half of the building. It only took me a few minutes to finish off Keith's section and put away his supplies. I made sure I didn't leave anything in any of his rooms, and I shut off the lights as I made my way back to the break room. It was 5 minutes until we were supposed to clock out, but Keith still wasn't back from my section. I wasn't worried at first because Keith was always a slow worker. But when our clock out time came and went, I became a little concerned. You see, both custodians had to be done with their job before they could leave. Keith was the only one who had the arming code for the building's security, so I was stuck staying until Keith finished up. I waited for another 10 minutes, occasionally checking my watch while I poked my head out into the main hall. Nothing. No Keith. It was now 11:15, and it was getting late for both of us. I'd had enough and decided to find Keith myself and get him to hurry up whatever he was doing. I quickly left the break room with a hurried pace toward my section. I didn't hear a vacuum or any type of movement coming from that direction, which had me wondering all sorts of things. What if Keith fell and hurt himself? What if Keith had a heart attack? What if Keith was taking a giant dump? I turned the corner and stopped. Everything was wrong. Everything was so very, very wrong. My entire section was dark. Keith was adamant about keeping the lights on, and he was obviously pissed off I'd walked into a room without switching them on. Why the hell would he be in an entire section with the lights off? I walked over to the light switches for the hallway and flicked them up. They flickered. They never flicker. It took a moment, but eventually the flickering stopped and the hallway was completely illuminated. I slowly walked down the hallway toward the classrooms. I'd put on the lights in each room, poked my head in, and looked for signs of Keith. After passing the first few rooms, I came to the room I'd entered without the lights on. I turned on the lights and walked in. Keith was slumped over the teacher's desk, and he was whimpering. I slowly walked over to him and placed my hand on his shoulder. "Keith, you okay?" I asked, my skin covered in goosebumps. Keith pulled his face from his hands and I gasped at what I saw. His face was covered with scratches and cuts. He was missing an eye and most of his hair had been torn out. There was dried blood everywhere. "What the fuck, Keith? What happened? How?" I asked, panicked. Keith was still whimpering. I fumbled for my phone and dialed 911. It rang only once and connected me. I explained everything to the operator and she assured me that an ambulance and a police officer would be there momentarily and that I should stay on the line. It wasn't long before emergency services showed up and I led them to the room. Keith was placed on a stretcher and loaded into the waiting ambulance. I called my boss and explained to him what had happened, leaving out the bit about me walking into a dark room and the hallways being dark. My boss instructed me to leave the lights on and to arm the building using his code, and the morning crew will take care of whatever cleanup there is. I wrote down his code, proceeded back to the break room where we also armed the building, set the alarm, and left. As I pulled my car around the building to get to the main road, I had to stop. All of the lights were off in the entire building. Not a single exterior light was on. Not a single exit sign was illuminated. It was so dark. I called my boss again, but it went straight to voicemail, so I left a message explaining what I was seeing. After I left the voicemail, I drove home with goosebumps still crawling all over my skin. The next day, I received a phone call from my boss telling me I had been suspended until further notice, and not even 2 days later, I received a letter in the mail stating my termination due to negligence. Keith never made it. He passed away shortly after everything happened. According to the paper, he had had a heart attack and died peacefully in his sleep. It didn't mention losing his eye or anything about the school at all. It didn't mention anything out of the ordinary. It's been about a month since all this went down. I wouldn't even be sharing this if I wasn't for what I'd experienced last night. I went to visit a friend who happened to live about a block from that school. It was about 11:30 at night, and I decided to stop by the school since I knew nobody was there. I just wanted to see if there was anything that could explain what the hell happened that night, or if everything was just me losing my mind. I pulled into the main parking lot that sits adjacent to my former section. I regret doing that, and the minute I pulled in, everything was wrong, and I knew right then and there I shouldn't have been there. The lights were off. The side entrance was open, and there was what looked to be Keith standing in the doorway. He was waving. No, he was beckoning me. I got the hell out of there. Never went back. Everybody has horror stories from their trips to the post office. Awful wait times, unruly customers, the clerk is an asshole, trying to ship something sucks. You probably heard them all. Mine's a little different. I work for the post office as a custodian. Worked here for the past 6 years. The pay's great and benefits are wonderful. I can't complain about the low level of difficulty the job entails either. Hell, I spend most of my day barely doing anything, but don't tell my boss that. I started off in my hometown at a pretty local office as a non-career employee and did that for 3 years. At this point, I'm convinced that every office is just the creepiest building. The one I worked at then had so many eerie, dark hallways and freaky little rooms. I wouldn't be surprised if it was haunted. 3 years ago, I made regular and moved to an office about half an hour away. My job was split between 2 different offices, and I loved it. Fortunately for me, being a giant scaredy cat, neither of our offices I needed to go to freaked me out. One is newer and the other is just a garage, nothing too unsettling there. About 6 months ago, my job got changed to a split between the newer office and a much older main office. It's a pretty huge building and has an upper floor as well as a basement. They're both pretty deserted most of the time. If I'm on either of these floors, I always get that paranoid, I'm being watched or followed feeling. Always. I mean, the brunt of the basement is pretty fucking creepy on its own. I can't even tell you how many times I've heard some inexplicable noises down there. Some strange tapping, footsteps when there's nobody there. I can even name a few times I've heard some quiet, distant voice off in the darkness. It really freaks me out being down there sometimes. A pretty large amount of activity that I've encountered down there comes from out of the boiler room. That's where I heard a voice the first time. I remember filling up a mop bucket at the sink in there and hearing what I thought was a woman's voice, very quiet, calling something out to me. I couldn't quite make out the words, and I don't remember them very well now, but I think it was almost calling for some kind of help. I've heard similar voices a few more times after that, but they always sound a little different, and always female. About 3 weeks ago, I was heading toward the supply area. To get to it, I have to cross this small, cramped hallway that passes by this kind of spooky stairwell that, as far as I know, hasn't been used in years. When I entered the hallway, I had to stop dead in my tracks. I heard footsteps on those stairs. They were a series of slow, heavy steps. It sounded like they'd get near the bottom and then suddenly restart back at the top. I couldn't explain it, but nobody ever popped up out of the bottom of them. I ran back upstairs to look through the small window on the exit door leading out into the deserted lobby. Maybe someone was just messing with me. Nothing. There was no sign of anyone in that stairwell. I ran down to the basement, and sure enough, I could still hear those footsteps loud and clear. Only now they'd been interspersed with what sounded like a tapping in the banister. Step, 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 tap, tap, tap. Step, 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 tap, tap, tap. Repeat. I figured that I should record it, and I didn't think anyone else would believe me what I was hearing. Here's what I recorded. After about 30 seconds of recording, the tapping changed. It became loud and almost aggressive, and frankly scared the proverbial shit out of me. I got the fuck out of there as quickly as I could. The next day I was telling my coworker, Steve, about the noises I'd heard. He'd worked at this office for a little over 20 years. I figured he'd be able to supply me with some sort of an explanation. "You heard it too, huh?" Steve asked me. "About time. I'm surprised you never heard that sooner." Curious now, I asked him what he meant by that. "Well, about 30 years ago, used to be a guy named Paul that worked here as a custodian. As the story goes, he spent a lot of his time fucking around, pacing up and down those stairs. He'd spend hours at a time doing nothing but that, or so they say. One day in December of '89, though, things took a tragic turn for Paul, so I've heard." I tilted my head, more inquisitive than anything now. "Oh? Go on." Steve nodded. "Well, supposedly the dude suffered from a mean bout of depression. Rough childhood, no wife or kids or anything, parents died young, all that good shit. I guess despite his tendency to screw off at work, it was the only place he felt at home. Which is pretty ironic, seeing as most people here at the time didn't like the guy. Found him weird and fairly creepy. Stood around corners just staring at people, never made an effort to make any friends or really communicate, nothing, just stayed silent and paced in that stairwell." I had a decent idea where this was going at this point, but I asked Steve to continue anyway. He obliged. "So this particular December afternoon, nobody had heard from Paul at all. Nobody saw him around that day, nobody got any calls saying he'd been out sick or something, nothing. So one of the supervisors remembered his nice little hiding place and went down there to check. She found Paul all right, only he was hanging from the upper floor of the stairs by his neck. Dude used a length of power cord that was up there. I'm told the poor woman had to quit that day and needed some pretty extensive therapy. I guess it really fucked her up. Most of the old-timers still here from then say you can still hear him pacing those stairs from time to time, which it sure sounds like you did, Alex." I stood there silently for a few moments, doing nothing but blinking. "You mean to tell me this fucking basement is actually haunted? Fucking Christ, Steve." "Hey man, that's just what I heard. Your story fits right in the mix." I nodded. "Fair enough." Though I had one more question for Steve. That doesn't explain those weird female voices I'd been hearing in the boiler room, though. Steve tensed up for a moment, hesitant to respond, but he did so with a light note of caution to his voice. "Well, Alex, there's another part to Paul's story that people tend to not want to talk about. It's pretty fucked up, so just say the word if you want me to continue." Thinking for a moment, I nodded my head. "Yeah, keep going. I want the full story." Steve nodded in turn and complied. "A lot of the guys here, they say the reason Paul was such a creepy loner, the guy was a goddamn serial killer. He'd kidnap random women every couple of months and bring them here to his sanctuary, slit their throats in the boiler room. They never found the bodies.